At the end of the Second World War, two nations emerged as military superpowers. They were the Soviet Union and the United States, otherwise known as the Russians and the Americans. Although they'd been allies in the Second World War, they really didn't like each other, and their dislike for each other quickly escalated into a conflict known as the Cold War. The most noticeable feature of the Cold War was that they didn't actually fight each other, but there was a lot of posturing and sabre rattling, and they felt very intimidated by each other. And they built up enormous arsenals of weapons to the point where if they ever actually had gone to war with each other, and if they ever had used all their weapons, the entire world would have been destroyed probably. Both sides put a lot of their resources into developing missile technology. They built huge rockets that were able to deliver nuclear weapons over long distances. And it reached the point where both sides were concerned that each other could fire missiles all the way into space to deliver bombs on each other. So this led to a whole new battle in the Cold War, which was called the space race. Both sides embarked on space programs that were built around scientific research and exploration, but with an underlying undertone that it could be used for military purposes if it had to be. For a long time, the Russians were way ahead of the Americans. The Russians put the first satellite into orbit. They put the first man into space. They were the first to hit the moon with a missile. It seemed that the Americans were always a couple of steps behind, playing catch-up, until it came to going to the moon. The Americans developed the Apollo program and successfully went to the moon, and the Russians never did. They had their own lunar program, but they could never get it to work, and eventually they gave it up. And at the end of the space race, the general feeling was that the Americans had won it spectacularly. It was exciting stuff for a schoolboy like me growing up at the time. The 6 o'clock news was showing rockets blasting off from Cape Canaveral and Apollo capsules splashing down in the Pacific. Front page of the newspaper was full of photographs of stuff and diagrams of trajectories and orbits, and it was great. And on television there was Star Trek and Lost in Space. It was great stuff. It was all about space exploration. And there was another popular show on television. There was a sitcom called I Dream of Jeannie. Nothing to do with science fiction or space. It was about a 2,000-year-old genie who lived in a bottle. The reason I mention it is because two of the lead characters in it were astronauts working for NASA. It would seem that being an astronaut had become such a mainstream part of our lives that the writers of the show felt that having astronauts playing the roles of ordinary American professionals was quite an acceptable thing to do. Since the end of the space race, since the end of the Apollo program in the 1970s, I don't remember ever seeing another television program where they had a character who was an astronaut, if it wasn't a science fiction show. It would seem that being a professional spaceman didn't turn out to be all that mainstream after all. I grew up in a small country town, but around about my 8th birthday, when the space race was in full swing, we packed up and moved to the city. Things are different in the city. Lots of things are different. It could be very overwhelming, but it wasn't for me. I took it all in my stride. I accepted it all. I just said, hey, this is the big city. They do things differently here. And one of the things that was different was that if you stood on the front lawn of my house and looked through the trees and over the hills a bit, there was a Saturn V rocket on its launch pad ready to blast off. I'd seen them on TV, I knew what they looked like. And you're in the big city now. This is normal stuff. I don't think I ever noticed that they never launched it. It always just sat there on its launch pad. I don't think I ever noticed that actually it was the steeple of a church. It's still sitting there. 50 years later, they still haven't launched it.